In the autumn of 1743, on a cold Tuesday morning in the second week of October, a 34-year-old man named Thomas Reid was riding a small brown horse along a narrow track that ran northwest into the high country of the Scottish Highlands. The morning was cold. The sky had been a thin, clear blue since dawn, the kind of high, cold blue that, in that part of the country in that time of year, almost always meant a hard frost by evening. Thomas had been on the road since before first light. He had been calculating, with the patient attention of a man who had spent the last 6 years of his life riding into remote glens with brass instruments in his saddle bags, how far he had still to go before he reached the small village where he was expected by midday. He was, in the autumn of his 34th year, a land surveyor in the employ of the Crown. He had been trained in Edinburgh at the small college where his father had been a tutor of mathematics, and he had been employed, since the age of 28, in the slow ongoing project of mapping the clan lands of the Western Highlands for the purposes of taxation and military administration. The work had begun, in some general sense, after the failed Jacobite rising of 1715. The work would continue, though Thomas did not yet know it on that cold October morning, until the second and final rising of 1745 was put down, and the Highlands were brought, by various harder methods than mapping, more fully under the administration of the Crown. He was, on that particular morning, riding into the country of the Mackenzies. He had been there once before, 3 years earlier, on a smaller commission. He knew the country a little. He knew also that the Mackenzies were a clan that had not, in the rising of 1715, taken the Jacobite side. They were a quiet clan. They had kept for generations to their own affairs in their own country. They had paid the Crown what the Crown asked of them. They had, in return, been left mostly alone. Thomas's commission on this October trip was to complete the survey of a particular high glen called Glen Sealg, which lay in the upper reaches of the Mackenzie territory. He was to measure the dimensions of a small loch in the upper part of the glen. He was to map the surrounding land. He was to estimate the carrying capacity of the grazing on the slopes above the loch. He was to produce a small, precise set of charts that would, in due course, be added to the larger atlas of the Highlands that the Crown's Office of Surveys was assembling in Edinburgh. It was, in the ordinary description of his work, a small, unremarkable commission. He reached the village in the upper part of Glen Sealg in the early afternoon. The village was called Echnacon. It consisted of perhaps 15 low stone houses, a small kirk, a small inn, and a scattering of byres and outbuildings, arranged in a rough cluster on the south side of a small burn that ran down through the glen toward the lower country. The houses were thatched with heather. The smoke from the small peat fires rose, in the cold afternoon air, in thin, pale columns. The dogs at the doors of the houses watched Thomas ride into the village with the patient attention of dogs that did not see strangers very often. Thomas dismounted at the small inn. He gave the horse to a boy of perhaps 12 who came out to meet him. He went inside. The innkeeper was a man of perhaps 50, in a worn dark coat and a clean linen shirt. His name, when he gave it, was Ian Mackenzie. He was, by his own brief account, the cousin of the laird who held the upper part of the glen. He had been told, several days earlier, by a rider from the lower country, that a Crown surveyor would be arriving to do work in the glen. He had prepared a room. He had prepared a small meal. He welcomed Thomas in the quiet, courteous way of a Highland man receiving a guest he had been told to expect, but whom he had not, on his own initiative, invited. Thomas ate the meal in the small, dim main room of the inn. He drank a small cup of strong, dark ale. He spoke, in his measured, educated Lowland English, with Ian Mackenzie about the work he had come to do. He explained that he had been sent to measure the Loch in the upper glen. He explained the practical procedure. He would, he said, need to take a small boat onto the water for the morning of the second day. He would need to row out to several points in the Loch in order to take careful soundings of its depth. He would then need to walk the shoreline with his measuring chain and his theodolite in order to record its dimensions and the contours of the surrounding land. He estimated, he said, that the entire work would take 3 to 4 days. He asked whether there was, in the village, a small boat he might hire for the morning of the second day. Ian Mackenzie, at the question about the boat, did not immediately answer. He looked at Thomas, in the dim light of the inn's main room, in a private way that Thomas could not, in the moment, read. After a pause, Ian said that there was, in the village, a small boat that was kept by one of the cousins of the laird for the purpose of fishing the lower part of the burn. The boat could, he said, be brought up to the Loch on the morning of the second day. He would arrange this. He would arrange, also, a man to bring the boat up and to be available at the Loch in case Thomas should need any practical assistance during the work. Thomas thanked him. He said that this would be entirely sufficient. Ian Mackenzie, when Thomas had finished, did not immediately move on to other matters. He continued to look at Thomas in the same private way. He seemed, in some way Thomas could not identify, to be considering whether he had something to say that he was not certain he should say. After another pause, Ian said that there was, on the matter of the Loch, something he felt he had to mention. He said that the Loch in the upper glen was, by the long custom of the Mackenzies, who had lived in the glen for many generations, divided in a particular way. The near shore of the Loch, the southeastern shore where the small burn drained out and where Thomas would be coming up from the village, was the shore that the Mackenzies used. They watered their cattle there in the summer months. They cut peat from the bog above the near shore. They walked the near shore freely, in the way that men walk shores they have known all their lives. The far shore of the Loch, the northwestern shore where the slopes rose up steeply toward the higher mountains, was a different matter. The far shore was not, Ian said, a shore that the Mackenzies used. It was not a shore that any of them, by the long custom of the glen, set foot on. It was not a shore that they hunted on, or grazed cattle on, or cut peat from, or fished from. It was, by the old agreement of the clan, a shore that belonged to something else. Ian did not, at this point, explain what the something else was. He said only that the agreement was very old. He said that the agreement was kept by all the men and women of the upper glen in their generations, without question. He said that the near shore was the shore of the Mackenzies. The far shore was the shore of the other. The water of the Loch was, by the agreement, a kind of shared country, but the shores were divided. And the Mackenzies, in their long, quiet history in the glen, did not cross the water to the far side. Thomas listened to this with a certain quiet attention. He had, in his 6 years of survey work in the Highlands, encountered a number of local customs of this kind. The Highlands were full of small old agreements between particular families and particular places, agreements about which fields were not to be ploughed, which springs were not to be drunk from on certain days, which paths were not to be walked in the dark of certain nights. He had come, over the years, to take such customs seriously, in the sense that he respected them where he could. But he had also come to understand that his work for the Crown sometimes required him to do things that local custom would not, in the ordinary course of life, have permitted. He said gently to Ian Mackenzie that he understood the custom. He said that he respected it. He said, however, that his commission was to measure the entire Loch, including the far shore, and that he would, in the course of the second day's work, need at some point to land a boat on the far shore in order to take certain measurements that could not be taken from the water alone. He asked Ian whether this would be a serious difficulty. Ian Mackenzie, at the question, did something that Thomas had not, in the moment, expected. He laughed. The laugh was not, Thomas heard immediately, a laugh of amusement. It was the soft, startled laugh of a man who had been told something so far outside his own understanding of the world that the only available response was a quiet, astonished sound. Ian laughed for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he stopped. He looked at Thomas across the small dim table, in the firelight of the inn's main room, in the way that a man looks at another man whom he has just realized he does not, in any meaningful sense, know. He said, "Mr. Reid, I will arrange for a boat to be brought to the Loch on the morning of the second day. I will arrange for a man to be at the shore. I will arrange for whatever else you require for your work. But I will not, on the matter of the far shore, give you any advice that you would find practical. I will only say what the men of this glen have said for as many generations as we have memory of. We do not cross to the far shore. We do not encourage strangers to cross to the far shore. The far shore is not ours to give permission for." Thomas said that he understood. He said that he would consider, in the morning, how to proceed. He thanked Ian for the warning. Ian nodded. He said that the room upstairs was prepared for him. He said that breakfast would be at 7 the following morning. He said that the boat would be brought up to the Loch by 10. He said good night. In the quiet, courteous way he had welcomed Thomas, and he went into the back of the inn to attend to other matters. Thomas sat for some time at the small table by the fire. He drank a second cup of the dark ale. He thought, in the slow, private way of a man considering an unexpected difficulty, about what he had been told. He had no doubt that the custom of the glen was as Ian had described it. The Highlands, as he had said earlier, were full of such customs. But the customs, in his 6 years of work, had always been customs that were, in the end, susceptible to the practical requirements of his commissions. He had walked fields that local people had told him were not to be walked. He had measured springs that local people had told him were not to be measured. He had, in every previous case, completed his work, and the world had not, in any visible way, ended. He saw no reason, that evening, to think that the Mackenzie custom about the far shore of the Loch in Glen Sealg would prove any different. He went up to his small room. He prepared his instruments for the following day's work. He went, eventually, to bed. The first day's work, the next morning, went without incident. Thomas walked the near shore of the Loch with his measuring chain. He set up his theodolite at 4 points along the southeastern shore. He took the slow, careful sights that the work required, recording the angles in the small leather-bound notebook he carried for the purpose. He sketched the contours of the slopes above the near shore. He measured the depth of the small burn that drained out of the Loch toward the village. He noted the carrying capacity of the grazing along the near shore, in the trained way of a man who had been doing this work for 6 years. The man Ian Mackenzie had sent to assist him was a quiet, older Mackenzie cousin of perhaps 60 years, named Donald. Donald did what Thomas asked of him. He held the chain. He carried the instruments. He spoke very little. He did not, all morning, look across the Loch toward the far shore. He kept his face, at all times, turned toward the near shore or toward the lower country down the glen. Thomas noticed this. He did not, during the work, comment on it. By the late afternoon of the first day, Thomas had completed the survey of the near shore. He returned to the village with Donald. He ate the evening meal at the inn. He spoke briefly with Ian Mackenzie about the next day's plan. He explained that he intended, in the morning, to take the boat onto the water. He intended to take soundings of the Loch's depth from several points across the surface. He intended, he said, to land at 1 or 2 points on the far shore in order to take the measurements he needed there. Ian Mackenzie listened to this without comment. He said, at the end, only that the boat would be ready at the Loch at first light. He said that Donald would come to the inn after breakfast to walk Thomas up. He said good night. Thomas slept that night with a small unease he could not, on examination, fully account for. He attributed it, in the quiet, private way of an educated man dismissing a feeling he did not wish to credit, to the strangeness of the country and the strangeness of the custom, and the strangeness of being alone in a high Highland glen on a cold October night. He went to sleep, eventually, around the small, low burning of his bedside candle, with the wind moving softly in the heather beyond the small window of his room. The morning of the second day arrived cold and clear. Thomas ate his breakfast. Donald came to the inn at the appointed time. They walked up to the Loch together. The boat had been brought up by other men of the village in the very early morning, and was waiting at the small stone landing on the southeastern shore. It was a small wooden boat of perhaps 12 feet, with a single set of oars and a small wooden seat at either end. It had been kept, by the look of it, in good repair, although it had not, by the further look of it, been used in some considerable time. Donald helped Thomas load the boat with his instruments. He held the boat steady while Thomas climbed in. He pushed the boat out from the landing. Thomas began to row. The morning was very still. The water of the Loch was, in the early light, perfectly flat, in the way that small lochs in high glens sometimes are on cold autumn mornings before any wind has risen. The surface of the water reflected the surrounding slopes with a clarity that was almost mirror-like. Thomas could see, as he rowed, the dark inverted shapes of the mountains hanging in the water below him, moving slowly past as he pulled at the oars. He stopped, after perhaps 200 yards, at the first sounding point he had marked from his work the previous day. He rested the oars. He prepared the small lead-weighted sounding line he carried for the purpose. He lowered it slowly into the water, watching the marks on the line as it descended. The Loch was, at that point, perhaps 40 feet deep. He recorded the measurement in his notebook. He took up the oars again. He rowed on toward the second sounding point, which he had marked at the rough center of the Loch. The Loch, he had estimated from his work the previous day, was perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the near shore to the far shore. He had reached the center of the Loch by perhaps 10:30 in the morning. He stopped again. He took the second sounding. The Loch at the center was 64 feet deep. He recorded the measurement. He looked while resting the oars around the Loch. The near shore behind him was now perhaps 400 yards distant. He could see Donald, a small dark figure at the small stone landing, watching him in the patient way that Highland men watch things from a distance. The far shore was perhaps 400 yards ahead of him. The slopes above the far shore rose up steeply toward the higher mountains. The shore itself was a narrow band of grey stone and short brown grass that ran along the foot of the slopes for perhaps half a mile. It was not, in any visible way, different from the near shore. There was no figure on it. Thomas had not, fully, expected there to be a figure on it. The custom of the glen, as Ian Mackenzie had described it, did not specifically suggest that the far shore was occupied. It suggested only that the far shore was not crossed. Thomas had assumed, in his rational consideration of the matter, that the custom was probably some old form of clan agreement with a neighboring people who no longer existed, or a religious prohibition that had long since lost its theological content, or a memory of some old territorial dispute that had hardened over the generations into a habit. He had not, in any serious way, considered that there might be something on the far shore that he would actually see when he rowed out to it. He took up the oars. He began to row toward the far shore. Checking he rowed slowly. The water was still very flat. The sound of the oars in the water was the only sound on the Loch, apart from the distant small sounds of the wind moving in the heather on the slopes above. Thomas was, by his nature, a man who liked the quiet of survey work in remote country, and he found himself, as he rowed, in the private state of attention that he had come to associate with his best work. He had rowed, perhaps, 200 yards toward the far shore when he noticed the change. The change was, in the first moment that he registered it, very small. It was simply that the slopes above the far shore, which had been the same as the slopes above the near shore in the way they took the morning light, had begun to take the light slightly differently. The color of the brown grass on the far slopes had not, in any particular way, altered. The shape of the slopes had not altered. The angle of the morning light had not, in the few minutes since he had last looked at it carefully, meaningfully changed. But the slopes above the far shore had become, in some way Thomas could not exactly identify, less easy to look at. His eye, when he turned it toward the far shore, did not quite settle. It moved across the surface of the slopes without finding the kind of small detail that the eye normally finds when it looks at landscape. The grass on the far slopes was the same grass as the grass on the near slopes, but the eye did not pick out the individual tussocks. The stones on the far shore were the same stones as the stones on the near shore, but the eye did not pick out the individual stones. The whole far side of the Loch had become, in some quality that Thomas could not name, a place that the eye preferred not to rest upon. Thomas stopped rowing. He sat in the small boat in the middle of the Loch, with the oars resting in their oarlocks, and he looked, with the trained, patient attention of a surveyor accustomed to looking at landscape, at the far shore. He could not, even with his trained attention, make himself see the far shore properly. This was, he understood at once, not a normal experience. Thomas had measured many shores in many countries. He had trained his eye over many years to see landscape with the kind of objective, patient attention that the work of survey required. He could, in the ordinary course of his work, look at a far shore 400 yards away and pick out, with the aid of his small brass telescope if necessary, the individual stones and the individual tussocks of grass and the individual small features of the contour. It was the basic competence of his profession. He could not, at that moment, do it. He took out his small brass telescope. He raised it to his eye. He pointed it at the far shore. The telescope showed him the far shore at the magnification he had calibrated it for. He could see, through the telescope, the small individual features of the shore that he had not been able to see with his unaided eye. He could see the stones. He could see the tussocks of grass. He could see the small, thin bands of frost in the shadowed places where the morning sun had not yet fully reached. He could see also that there was a figure standing on the far shore. The figure was at the center of the visible band of the shore. It was standing perfectly still. It was, by the relative scale of it against the stones and the grass around it, approximately the height of a man. It was not, however, a man. Thomas held the telescope very still. He looked, with the slow, patient attention of a man who had just realized that the subject of his looking was something that mattered very much, at the figure on the far shore. The figure was shaped like a man in its general outline. It had, in approximately the right places, the head and the shoulders, and the long arms and the long legs that a man's body would have. It was, in approximately the right proportion, the height that a man would be. Its general silhouette, as a silhouette, was the silhouette of a tall man standing still on a shore. But the figure was not a man. The proportions, when Thomas looked at them carefully through the telescope, were not exactly the proportions of a man. The arms were slightly too long. The head was slightly too narrow. The shoulders were slightly too high. The legs, where they joined the body at the hips, did so at an angle that no man's legs ever did. The figure had no face. The head had, where a face would have been, only a smooth pale surface that took the morning light in a way that human skin did not take it. There were no features. There were no eyes. There was no mouth. There was only the smooth pale surface, in approximately the place where a face would have been looking, in some way that Thomas could not understand without a face to look with, directly across the water at the small wooden boat in the middle of the Loch. The figure was, Thomas understood in the long, slow seconds of his looking, watching him. He lowered the telescope. The far shore, with the unaided eye, appeared exactly as it had appeared a few minutes earlier. The slopes were the same brown slopes. The shore was the same narrow band of stone and grass. There was, with the unaided eye, no figure visible on it at all. He raised the telescope again. The figure was still there. It had not moved. It was still watching him, with its smooth, pale, unfeatured place where a face would have been, in the way that something which does not need eyes to see watches a thing it has been waiting for. Thomas lowered the telescope a second time. He sat in the small boat, in the middle of the Loch, with the morning sun falling on the still, flat water around him, and he understood several things in a short, close sequence. He understood that the custom of the Mackenzies was not a custom that had outlived its original cause. The original cause was still on the far shore. The original cause had been on the far shore, possibly, for as long as the Mackenzies had lived in the glen, possibly for very much longer than that. He understood that the agreement Ian Mackenzie had described, the agreement about the near shore and the far shore and the water between, was an agreement that had two parties. One party was the Mackenzies. The other party was the figure on the far shore, or whatever the figure on the far shore represented. The agreement was that the Mackenzies did not cross the water to the far side, and the figure on the far shore did not cross the water to the near side. The agreement had been kept by both parties for as long as the Mackenzies could remember. He understood that he, Thomas Reid, in his small wooden boat in the middle of the Loch, had placed himself in the water that lay between the two shores, the water that was, by Ian's description, a kind of shared country. He had not yet crossed to the far side. He had not yet broken the agreement on his own behalf, or by extension on the Mackenzies' behalf. He was still, in the strict reading of the agreement, in the place where the agreement was kept rather than the place where the agreement was broken. But he had, by rowing out into the middle of the Loch with the intention of crossing, entered the place where the agreement was being negotiated, and the figure on the far shore had come to the shore to negotiate. The figure was not, Thomas understood, threatening him. It was simply waiting. It was waiting to see whether he would come the rest of the way. It was waiting to see whether the small, ordinary man in the small wooden boat would, in the private decision of his own free will, complete the trespass that he had begun. If he completed it, the figure would be ready. If he did not complete it, the figure would, presumably, return to whatever it did when it was not standing on the shore waiting for trespassers. The agreement would resume. The Mackenzies' side of the agreement would have been, in some sense, technically violated by Thomas's having rowed into the shared water with the intention of crossing. But the trespass would not have been completed, and the figure, by some old logic of the agreement that Thomas could not read but could vaguely sense, would accept the partial violation as the kind of small thing that did not, in the long, quiet keeping of an agreement of many centuries, require any response. Thomas sat in the boat for some time, with the telescope in his hand and the oars resting in their oarlocks, and he considered what to do. He considered the practical question of his commission. He had been sent by the Crown to measure the Loch. The measurement of the Loch required, by the strict reading of his orders, the survey of the far shore. If he did not complete the survey of the far shore, his commission would be incomplete. He would have to return to Edinburgh with a partial map. He would have to explain to the senior older men at the Office of Surveys why the far shore of a small loch in a remote highland glen had not been measured. He considered what he would say. He could say, he thought, that the far shore had been inaccessible due to the steepness of the slopes. He could say that the local people had refused to assist him in the work. He could say that the weather had turned on the morning of the second day and had prevented him from completing the boat work. Any of these explanations would, he knew, be accepted by the office. The office did not, in its long practical experience of survey work in the Highlands, expect every commission to be completed in full. There were always small failures. There were always small gaps in the maps. The far shore of a small loch in a small upper glen was, in the larger scheme of the Crown's mapping project, a very small gap. He considered also the question of his own private knowledge. He had seen, through his telescope, the figure on the far shore. He had understood in the slow seconds of his looking what the figure was, or at least what the figure represented. He could, if he chose, row to the far shore. He could land. He could take the measurements. He could complete his commission. He could return to Edinburgh with a complete map and the small private knowledge of having seen, with his own eyes through his own brass telescope, something that the educated men of Edinburgh did not believe could exist. He considered, in the slow, private way of a man considering the most important decision of his life, what such knowledge would be worth to him, what he would do with it, how he would carry it. He understood, after some quiet consideration, that he would not survive carrying it. He did not understand this in the sense of a physical threat. He did not believe, exactly, that the figure on the far shore would harm him in any ordinary physical way if he completed the crossing. The agreement, as he had read it in the slow seconds of his looking, was not an agreement about physical harm. It was an agreement about something deeper and more particular than physical harm. It was an agreement about the kind of looking that took place between the two shores, and about the kind of person one became after the looking had been completed. He understood that he did not want to become that kind of person. He understood also that the partial trespass he had already committed by rowing into the shared water was a small enough trespass that it could still be undone. He had not yet landed on the far shore. He had not yet completed the looking. The figure on the far shore had seen him approach, but the figure had not yet, in the strict sense of the agreement, received him. He could turn the boat around. He thought about this for perhaps 2 minutes. The morning sun continued to fall on the still, flat water. The small, distant sounds of the wind in the heather continued. The figure on the far shore, when he raised the telescope a final time to look at it, continued to stand exactly as it had been standing, watching him with its smooth, pale, unfeatured place where a face would have been, waiting for his decision. Thomas put the telescope away. He took up the oars. He turned the small wooden boat in a slow, steady arc on the still water until its bow was pointing back toward the near shore. He began to row. He did not look back at the far shore as he rowed. He did not need to. He understood, with the same private certainty with which he had understood everything else in the long, slow sequence of his looking, that the figure was watching him row away. He understood that the watching was not, in the ordinary sense, hostile. The watching was simply the watching of something that had come to the shore to see whether the agreement would hold, and that was now, in its slow, patient way, observing the answer. He rowed steadily back toward the near shore. The trip back took perhaps 15 minutes. The water remained perfectly still. The sun rose slightly higher in the cold blue sky. Thomas's hands on the oars were, he noticed at some point in the rowing, shaking very slightly. He did not stop rowing. He reached the small stone landing in the early afternoon. Donald was still there, still watching from the same place he had been watching when Thomas had rowed out. Donald did not say anything when Thomas brought the boat in. He helped Thomas tie it up. He helped Thomas unload the instruments. He did not, at any point, ask Thomas what he had seen, or what he had not seen, or why he had returned without landing on the far shore. Donald simply walked Thomas back down to the village. He left him at the door of the inn. He nodded once, in a small private way that Thomas did not fully understand at the time, but understood later, and he went on to whatever the rest of his afternoon's work required of him. Thomas went into the inn. He sat down at the small table by the fire. He sat for a long time without doing anything in the warm, dim light of the main room while the small, low fire burned and the day proceeded around him. Ian Mackenzie came to the table eventually. He sat down across from Thomas. He did not, for some time, say anything. After a long pause, he said, quietly, "You take a small cup of whiskey, Mr. Reid." Thomas said that he would. Ian went to the small cabinet behind the bar. He returned with 2 small wooden cups and a small dark bottle. He poured 2 small measures. He set one in front of Thomas. He kept one for himself. He raised his cup slightly in a small private gesture. Thomas raised his. They drank in silence in the warm, dim light of the main room of the inn. Ian said, after the cups had been emptied, only, "It is a hard thing, Mr. Reid, to have known what you have known and to have come back from the Loch as you have come back. I will not, for my part, ask you any questions about it. I will only say that the men of this glen are grateful to you. The agreement holds. The agreement has held for a very long time, and we are, in our quiet way, glad that it has held also for you." Thomas did not, in the moment, know what to say. He nodded. He thanked Ian for the whiskey. He went up, eventually, to his small room. He lay, for the rest of the afternoon, on the small narrow bed in the small dim room, and he thought about what he had seen. He completed, the following day, the parts of the survey that could be completed without landing on the far shore. He measured the contours of the slopes from his side of the Loch. He took several more soundings from the boat, all from positions on the near shore side of the center line of the water. He did not, on the second boat trip, look at the far shore through his telescope. He did not need to. He knew what was on the far shore. He did not need to confirm it again. He left the village on the morning of the fourth day. He rode south through the lower country toward Edinburgh. The journey took 5 days. The country he rode through was the same country he had ridden through on his way north. The villages were the same villages. The inns were the same inns. The road was the same road. But Thomas Reid, riding south on the small brown horse, was not the same man who had ridden north into Glen Sealg 6 days earlier. He returned to the Office of Surveys in Edinburgh. He delivered to the senior older men who assembled the larger atlas, his maps and his charts and his notebooks. He explained that the far shore of the Loch in Glen Sealg had not been surveyed in detail because the local people had not been willing to assist with the boat work on the far side, and because the slopes above the far shore had been too steep to permit a safe landing in the limited time available. The senior older men accepted his explanation, in the way the office always accepted such explanations. The atlas, when it was eventually published, contained a small, detailed map of the near shore of the Loch in Glen Sealg and a small partial sketch of the far shore based on Thomas's observations from the boat, and a small precise note that the far shore was inaccessible to the surveyor. Thomas continued, for many years, in the work of survey. He rose in the Office of Surveys to a position of some quiet seniority. He trained, in his later career, several younger men who came into the work as he had come into it. He never returned to Glen Sealg. He married, in his 37th year, the daughter of a small Edinburgh merchant. He had 3 children with her. He lived a quiet, ordinary life, in the steady Edinburgh manner of an educated lowland Scot in the middle decades of the 18th century. He attended kirk on Sundays. He read books in the evenings. He raised his children, with his wife, in the quiet, private way of educated parents who wish their children to be both well prepared for the world and gentle in their hearts. He did not, for many years, speak to anyone of what he had seen at the Loch. He attempted, in the way that Edmund Carlyle of Marrowfield Manor would attempt many decades later in a different country, to put the experience aside. The attempt was, by his own private assessment, only partially successful. The thought of the figure on the far shore arrived, unbidden, in moments when he had not expected it. The thought arrived in the middle of ordinary working days. The thought arrived in the deep hours of restless nights. The thought arrived when he encountered, in the course of his quiet, ordinary life, things that reminded him in some small way of the still, flat water, or the cold, blue October sky, or the smooth, pale place where a face would have been. He carried the looking throughout his life, in the way that all the Mackenzies of the Upper Glen had carried, in their generations, the agreement. He did not speak of it. He did not act on it. He did not, in any visible way, allow it to disturb the ordinary patterns of his ordinary life. But he was, in the inner life of Thomas Reid, a man who had seen something at the edge of the world that other men had not seen. And he was, he understood, a man who had been seen in return. The figure on the far shore had watched him, through whatever it had used in place of eyes, for the long, slow seconds of his looking. The watching had registered something, in whatever it had used in place of memory. Thomas Reid was, after that morning, a man who had been looked at by something that the educated men of Edinburgh did not believe could look at anything. The knowledge of having been looked at did not, in any clear sense, harm him. He continued his life. He raised his children. He died, eventually, in the autumn of his 79th year, in his small, quiet house in the new town of Edinburgh, surrounded by his wife and his children and the small, ordinary objects of an ordinary life. The death itself was peaceful. He told the story in his very last weeks to his eldest son. The son was, at the time of the telling, a man in his middle 40s, a steady Edinburgh advocate of some quiet success, with a wife and children of his own. Thomas told him the story across 2 long evenings in the slow, patient detail in which he had been holding it for over 40 years. The son listened. The son did not, for the most part, interrupt. When Thomas had finished, the son sat for a long time without speaking. The son said, finally, only that he was glad his father had told him. He said that he would think about it. He did not, that evening, ask his father any questions. Thomas died 11 days later. The death was peaceful. His final words, by the son's account, were not about the Loch or the figure or the still, flat water. They were about a small detail of a financial matter that he had wanted to clarify with the son before he died. The eldest son, in his own life, did not travel to Glen Sealg. He did not, in his own later account, ever investigate whether the Loch was still as his father had described it, or whether the Mackenzies still kept the old agreement, or whether the figure on the far shore was still there in its long, patient watching. He did not investigate any of these things, he said, in the rare moments when he discussed the matter with anyone, because he had concluded that the proper response to his father's story was to let it stand as it was. Some inheritances were for carrying rather than for acting on. He carried it, for the rest of his own life, in the way his father had carried it. In the upper part of Glen Sealg, in the old country of the Mackenzies, the Loch presumably continues to lie in its small stone bed between its two shores. The Mackenzies who still live in the glen, in whatever form the Mackenzies of the glen still take in the modern world, presumably continue to keep the agreement. The near shore is theirs. The far shore is not. The water between is the shared country in which the agreement is kept. The figure on the far shore presumably continues to come to the shore in those rare moments when a stranger rows out into the middle of the water to see whether the agreement will hold. The figure presumably continues to watch, with whatever it uses in place of eyes, the small wooden boats of the rare strangers as they consider their decisions in the slow seconds of their looking. The figure presumably continues to wait for the next traveller who completes the crossing. The agreement, the long memory of the glen suggests, has held for as long as the glen has been remembered. Whether it will continue to hold is a question that depends, in each generation, on the private decisions of the small ordinary travellers who happen, in the course of their ordinary lives, to row out into the shared water and to see what is waiting for them on the far shore. Thomas Reid made the decision he made. He turned the boat around. He carried, for the rest of his life, the knowledge of what he had seen and the knowledge of what he had chosen not to complete. May the strangers who come to such lochs in such glens, in their generations, find the same quiet strength to turn their small boats around. May the agreements that have held for many centuries continue, in their slow, patient way, to hold. May the figures that wait on the far shores remain, in the long, patient watching of their old country, undisturbed by the trespass of those who do not understand what they are looking at. Good night.